Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is This Sunday's show at Dramatic International, the only prime-time program explaining Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. And I'm Natalia Humaniuk. I'm back to the studio. And of course, we have the topic of the week. Since the Ukrainian delegation has officially left the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, naming the organization as discredited. As we know, earlier this week, PASE adopted a resolution that would see Russia return to the Assembly Hall with 118 deputies voting in favor and 62 against. What's important that Russia was brought back its right and responsibilities unconditionally. In doing so, the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe de facto lifted sanctions against Russia imposed for its aggression against Ukraine. So the body imposed sanctions on Russia in April 2014, following the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and the war in Donbass, depriving Russians of their right to vote. Therefore, the Russian delegation stopped participating in the work of the Parliament Assembly of the Council of Europe, but they were officially invited to return to the Assembly this week. And now Russia will be able to resume its work with the Parliament Assembly and to introduce deputies also from the occupied Crimean Peninsula to its delegation. We also know that partly the reason for that is the fact that the Russian contribution to the Council of Europe had been freezed, and the organization had been heavily dependent on the Russian money, which also is about the whole balance of the way how the Council of Europe and the Parliament Assembly in particular operates. I'm happy to have here in the studio quite a big panel. We have Maria Ionova, who is a Ukrainian MP from the bloc Petro Poroshenko and a member of the Ukrainian delegation and worked with the Committee on Migration, Refugees and Displaced Persons in the Parliament Assembly of Council of Europe, also coming back from Strasbourg. Sasha Romantsova is the Ukrainian human rights defender and executive director of the Center for Civil Liberties. And Andreas Umland is a German politologist, analyst, and a fellow at the Institute for Euro-Atlantic Cooperation based here in Ukraine. We'll also have on Skype other members of the delegations, also from Georgia, and human rights defenders in Ukraine. But I would like you shortly to explain, I guess most of our audience, they followed the story. Yeah, no, but I would explain what you think the most important has happened and what should happen next.
The most important has happened that there are countries and there is a minority who is defending and who is fighting for the principles and values. And it's not only Ukraine, of course, there are 7 countries who has written a joint declaration. What is further, it's, for example, tomorrow in the Ukrainian parliament, we will have a committee for foreign affairs, and the only one question and like an agenda, it's regarding situation, what is going on, and what we have to do, our further steps regarding Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe. And it will not be only about Ukraine. I think that it's not like a chance. It's we have to coordinate our efforts, our actions with our partners. I mean, the 6 countries. And I think this fight, I mean, this war is still over because Russia Federation didn't ratify their credentials in a full way. Yeah, it's just half. And in autumn, it will be a decision on Venice Commission. I mean, anyway, the biggest shame is that the organization, it was, hemicycle, it's discredited. And that's what Putin wanted. So it's, how to say, it's not about Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. I mean, it's second time. The biggest mistake and the biggest fail is that Putin wanted to discredit this organization, and he has done it by the hands of big European and not only European countries. Because financial part, which you have mentioned, yes, it's probably important and so on, but for such big countries, which they have, I mean, profits in their budget, for them, around 70 million euro for 2 years, it's nothing. As you remember, last session, we had a Georgian prime minister, and he has announced that small Georgia, very strong country, is ready to pay 500,000 euro as on like beneficiary. So just one small country. That is why I think that the picture is much more wider, and it's not only a question of money.
So, Sasha, what it means for the issues you care and we care, because the Council of Europe is a tool to protect freedoms also in our country, and Ukraine has so many international issues, in particular connected to Russia. So what also your concern, and we'll probably go later into the discussion on what Ukraine should do at this stage.
First of all, we need to remember that it's really important, our relationship with different partners in Europe, and Council of Europe, it's one of the places where we spoke about human rights and the principles of human rights. So that's why so important that Russia Federation can be back, bring back only without any any steps from their side, like for example release of our political prisoners, our sailors, or other people who is hostages in the Donbas area. So that's why, as for me, it's like if we will speak about dialogue, that Russia Federation now need to just make a huge number of steps to showing that really okay, we're back to dialogue. So dialogue about human rights. So we started from some questions, not about political question, but about question human rights. So I think it will be like next period we will see what happened in this dialogue. Do this like management of Council of Europe really made this dialogue with Russia Federation, and Russia Federation will do something about human rights.
I would ask also to bring, before we get to Andres, the map of the countries who voted for Russia's return to PACE and the countries which also voted against. You can see that they're quite not that many, while big countries as France, as Spain voted in favor, partly against was Germany. I also should bring the quote of the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, who said that, we had it on a tweet, that Russia belongs in the Council of Europe with all the rights and obligations that entails, and Foreign Minister Heiko Maas welcomes the compromise reached for Russia to remain in the Council of Europe. This is good news for Russian civil society. We'll talk about with the representative of the Russian civil society. Andras, you're not here to speak on behalf of the German ministry, but why you think these things happen, how you also explain. The Ukrainians were quite kind of, not just the Ukrainians, there were a lot of people we call friends of Ukraine and MPs lobbying that these things don't happen, but why they failed?
I have myself also signed an open letter of lots of policy experts who have protested against the readmission of Russia under these conditions to the Council of Europe. And the really embarrassing thing here is that there were a whole number of resolutions of the Parliamentary Assembly, and Russia hasn't fulfilled anything of the demands, any of the demands of the Council of Europe, and was nevertheless readmitted. On the other hand, I also see what stands behind this decision by countries like Germany. This is simply the desire to keep some places of interaction with Russia intact. Russia has been kicked out of the G8 group, which became the G7 group. The summits between the European Union and Russia have stopped. So there are actually not that many places left where one can, in a regular fashion, interact with Russia, and one has to admit that, unfortunately, for Germans and for the French and for others, these geopolitical issues here in Eastern Europe are not that important. Like for the Poles or for the Estonians, if you look at the countries on the map of the countries that where the delegations left the Council of Europe, this is basically what is called the intermarium. These are the countries that are in the same kind of geopolitical situation. They have the same assessment of all of that, and they are ready to sacrifice as well. They are ready to sacrifice their own relations with Russia. For a German, for a Spaniard, this is all, the stakes are very high. The Council of Europe is not so important. It's more a human rights organization.
No, but you just mentioned that that it's very important for Germany to return Russia Federation for dialogue. But may I ask you, do you believe that this? No, like, but
That's
okay,
Mars,
but
what Mars
that's
Yeah, that's what the minister
okay, but
wants. It's not.
but it's also like double standards. These people, they are not decision makers, and that is why, or if they will be in the Council of Europe or not, I mean, they do not decide anything. And the problem is that also there are a lot of stereotypes that they think that Ukrainian, Georgia, and other delegation, they don't want to see Russia Federation in Council of Europe. It's wrong. We are in favor, but with the sanctions, because even we were asking, like, you know, for minimum sanctions for Russia Federation, as they really didn't implement any provision from any resolution.
But the situation was now that Russia would either leave the Council of Europe entirely and get out of the
We
European
are always
Council.
looking forward how to make Russia like on the agenda.
I'm not defending here the German
I'm
position.
trying to say,
I'm just trying to explain it. And you know, for these German politicians and diplomats, this is a channel of information, of consultation, of diplomacy. And they want to keep it. And what stands behind all of this is, at the end of the day, is plain fear. Yeah. It's the fear that we will get at the end of some sort of major European conflict, World War III, something like that. And there's a huge demand in these Western European societies to keep these channels of communication open. And this is one of the channels of communication. It's not an important one, but it's one of those that is left. And so, you know, I think it's not a good decision, but I can understand what is sort of in the German politicians or the West European politicians and diplomats' minds when they make this decision.
I should also say that, like, in order to maintain balance, we as the Ukrainian media, we probably, like this week, ask maybe quite a few dozen of the comments from various MPs, in particular from the countries which voted which voted for. Unfortunately, we didn't get their answers. They weren't really ready to talk. But we have a comment of the Petra de Sutter, who is the Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe rapporteur, responding to the question, how much has the question of the debt owned by Russia influenced the debates?
In my view, in all the discussions that we had, I have not one time heard anyone saying, oh, we really need the Russians back for the money. Not one time. And in the presentations of the candidates for Secretary General, we've heard very good ideas about how to solve the budgetary situation. We don't need the Russians back. This institution must be able to function without blackmail from members leaving or threatening to leave and cutting the budget. Of course, we need resilience there. We need alternatives, and it's perfectly possible to think about them. For me, in my mind, not a single time I have defended this report because of the budgetary things.
I also would like that I'm waiting if we have our colleague from Russia already joining, because there was a lot of discussions about the fact that this would help the Russian civil society. The Russian civil society, I would probably also ask to bring, but at the same time, I would like to bring some of the reaction from Russia. So, for instance, there was a tweet also from one of the quite a famous Russian politicians, Senator Alexei Pushkov. I would like that also is brought to the screen, that the demarche of pro-Ukrainian states had barely happened when the coalition of opponents of Russia had split. Georgia and Lithuania abandoned Ukraine by deciding to remain at the PASE session. All this despite the angry denunciation from the officials of the two countries. And the reason being the main battles was lost. There was no need to take a stand in vain. A lot of commentators really mentioned that this is quite an arrogant stand of the issue of being not punished. But we have with us the Member of Council at the Memorial Human Rights Center in Moscow, Sergei Davidis. So, Sergei, let us know, because usually, so what are your position on what has happened and the whole idea of Russia being back? To what extent is really helpful to your organization and the defense of the human rights in Russia? Because usually it's mentioned that the whole thing is made in particularly to support the human rights organization and the people whose rights are violated.
Do you speak English?
Yeah, we do speak English, yeah.
Actually, generally, position of my organization, Human Rights Center Memorial, is that it's not acceptable that European community gave up to Putin's pressure and allowed him to continue doing what he was doing and lifted the sanctions in pace. But my personal position differs from position of Human Rights Center Memorial. For sure, our organization also doesn't want that Russia goes out of Council of Europe, because it will make a lot of problems for civil society, for human rights defenders in Russia. But general position is that we should pay this price. And we cannot advocate for lifting the sanctions. And actually, we haven't advocated anyway, neither Memorial as whole, nor me personally, in spite of the fact that I represent minority in Memorial's board, that suppose that it's a rather good decision that the threat of Russia's going out of pace is taken away. Actually, my position is connected with a few factors. The first, that there were no results, actual results that the sanctions has given. They haven't influenced behavior of Putin's regime. For sure, it's psychologically, emotionally very unpleasant to lift the sanctions in a situation when no steps from other side was made, and actually no steps has been made. The second reason I think it's important, if Russia goes out of Council of Europe, it will leave Russian population without possibilities to appeal to European Court. And the less it's not only a selfish desire of Russian Russian citizen, to have possibilities to appeal in spite of everything, but I think, and I'm sure actually, that the more possibilities regime has to suppress civil society, the less instruments society has to defend itself, the more free Putin's regime is on the external field of actions. The more possibilities it has to be aggressive, because if Russian civil society representatives lose possibility to appeal to European Court, they will not be able oppose this regime effectively. Their rights would be defended much less, and the regime will have much less problem inside the country that will allow it do more outside of the country. And the third reason, I think, is that anyway, being in the frameworks of European constructions like Council of Europe and particularly PACE, the regime, the Russian state, anyway is connected with European system. It somehow is restricted in its behavior, and if it is out of all these limitations, of all these connections, it's much more simple for them to carry out aggressive external policy, to violate international obligations, to violate human rights both inside and outside Russia.
Sergei, then thanks a lot for elaboration on the position, which know that there is a discussion between the human rights organization in Moscow. Maybe I would also ask if you have the comments on that.
I want to come back. Andreas says you are right that probably Germans see that we have to have dialogue. But the problem, not only, okay, even without sanctions, but the problem is that even they didn't want to vote for the amendments which mentioned Crimea, which mentioned human rights, violation of human rights in Crimea, which annexation and hostages from Crimea and Donbass and political prisoners in Donbass. So it was mentioned only about sailors, not even as prisoners of war. So that is why, of course, it's hard to believe that it's very simple that they would like to have such a dialogue, and they think that this it will change Russia Federation. No, because immediately during their speeches, MPs from Russian Federation were saying that we are Russia Federation. No one will tell us how to act and so on. So immediately they were saying that everything is a liar, it's everything Ukraine and so on. So they do not understand such diplomatic language. That's the issue. And I think that it will be worse. So they will act more, because that was a green light for them to violate, more aggressively, as they were not punished. That's the issue. And about human rights, a lot of journalists, they analyzed the situation with the human rights, and especially European Court for Human Rights, especially for Russia Federation. First of all, Constitutional Court, they have made a decision that it's not obligatory to implement any decisions of international
the Constitutional Court of Russia.
Yes, also, I can tell you that for 21 years, when Russia Federation became a member of Council of Europe, so there were 11,700 cases, 2,500 were sent to implement, and only 1,000 have been implemented by Russia Federation for 21 years. So it's not a problem from our side.
Sasha, you are talking to quite a few, and you're cooperating with quite a few Russian human rights defenders. So really, how you think the impact of the whole decision?
For understanding, nobody from human rights defenders from Russian Federation, they not accept the occupation of territory of Donbass or annexation of Crimea. For understanding, that means they have different position about how Russian Federation need to be pushing to the release people, release this territory, and stop some violation. For understanding, so it's not enemies for Ukraine. It's people who trying to understand how they need to acting inside this regime. They call them the regime because they trying to separate population of Russia Federation and government and all these guys who don't like, first of all, don't like their own human rights defenders. And second, for surely I understand their position when they told about that we need Council of Europe, we need mechanism of human rights European Court. But for us, if we will speak about, we have different position about what kind of strategic we need to push Russian Federation to be more care about human rights. So surely, we're working together about Crimea, about our political prisoners, because without their help, we don't have enough information what happened inside the Russian prison about these people, and they help us to find some legal aid for people who was in the court, for Crimea Tatarians, and for whole other 98 cases about political prisoners. So it's a people which we were working together in this topic, and we don't have different position in that. But in this international strategic, we have a different position.
But also, when we meet very often in the Parliamentary Assembly, Council of Europe, because they also provided a lot of side events. and we
Not
were
lot, just-
not lot, but okay,
just two.
more Ukrainians, more like British. But anyway, we were in we were in a contact with them, and it doesn't mean that we are cooperating with them. It's of course we are not against them.
Marie, we just had a chance also a bit early, just before the program, talk shortly to your colleague Volodymyr Ariev, who is the chairman of the Ukraine's delegation in the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, in particular talking about the decision to step out. So, Volodymyr, let us know what are the next steps of the Ukrainian delegation? What are the demands at this stage? What do you think is still could be done?
Well, after all, what have happened last week in the Council, in the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, the only one way is to be developed the relations between Ukraine and Parliamentary Assembly, is to revise our relations. And tomorrow morning we will be having the meeting of the Committee for Foreign Affairs and as well Bureau of the Parliament to discuss the proposals, and one of them is to withdraw an invitation for Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe to take part in the observation mission on snap elections in Ukraine on July 21st. As well as we will be recommending to the Speaker of Parliament, Andrei Parubij, to cancel his participation in annual meeting of the heads of the parliament that should hold on in Strasbourg in September. Well, we are going now to discuss the possible resolution of Ukrainian Parliament in regard of the possible suspending of our participation in the current session of the Council of Europe. But I would like to go ahead too much. So our clear vision now that that violation of the principles and values, the breakdown of the principles values that have happened in the Council of Europe should not remain unanswered, and the answer might be in the very, very proper way.
Still, you mentioned, for instance, the snap elections and not a participation of the delegation as observation. Can you argue for your position? How would it help to, stop Russia? Doesn't just make things worse, particularly for the Ukrainian elections, and maybe it would also remind us the thinking behind the idea to get out of the participation at the Council of Europe of the Ukrainian delegations, which the critics of this decision would say that it leaves Ukraine not influencing the Parliament Assembly.
I would like to underscore that the crucial important to not to remain this situation unanswered. What kind of dialogue or influence we have to remain if the body is entrusted to this body as a parliamentary assembly is very seriously undermined. By the way, I would like to ask you, how would you like to probably to invite and to welcome Russian parliamentarians for Ukrainian observation missions. When the state that made clear aggression against Ukraine now could possibly send their parliamentarians to observe Ukrainian elections, and these kind of our obstacles that we said that it's a serious obstacle not to do that, but it was ignored by the Assembly. So we should do in the proper way. But one situation remains, as well as my challenge to Russian credentials, still alive. and we're waiting for the results of the Venice Commission that should answer: does parliamentarians elected by nationwide constituency in Russian Federation, does they are real parliamentarians as well as they were elected within the votes of annexed Crimea? So we need to suspend our participation in this election, in this part session, and since the next year, I think we can revise this decision if Venice Commission decides about the presence of possibility of presence of parliamentarians that were elected within the votes of Crimean.
Can you please nail down, so what are the conditions for the Ukrainian delegation? I know you kind of, there would be the elections in Ukraine, so there would be the maybe parliament delegation change. Still at this stage, what are the conditions for the Ukrainian delegation to return?
I wouldn't like to go ahead, as I've said before, as well as we will be discussing it tomorrow. But the crucial things that Council of Europe should provide with the Russian Federation, the execution of things that were promised. First of all, we were deceived by Council of Europe, by Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe, when they said that only significant steps should be a condition for full restoring of Russian Federation delegation rights. So it hadn't happened. So all our delegation, not only our delegation, others that were joining us were felt cheated. So very important if Council of Europe goes with the Russian Federation to execute something like a release of Marines and vessels, release of political prisoners, and establish control over the situation with the rights of Crimean Tatars. It's a minimum request from our side should be.
Okay, so thanks a lot for clarification, and we will have the discussion in the studio with your colleagues. So my question is, do you find this decision to leave for the Ukrainian delegation as inefficient?
Well, I would say that what it needs is really a harsh reaction from Ukraine, because the problem here is simply that first things come first, and that the violations of the basic rules of the Council of Europe by Russia have been so severe with the annexation and with an ongoing war that you cannot simply, return to to business as usual. Whether a full withdrawal from the Council of Europe is the best way, I'm not sure. Maybe it is. Maybe something, and especially if other countries would support Ukraine, that would be something very, very symbolic. But sometimes people mention, well, there's the issue with Cyprus and Turkey and Nagorno-Karabakh and all these other things, but there was no annexation before, and there's an ongoing war. There's fighting every day. Every week Ukrainians are killed. So it's really an extraordinary situation that demands an extraordinary response. I don't know the sort of the council well enough to say whether a full withdrawal is the most useful thing to do, but it certainly needs to. Ukraine cannot simply, back down and then continue as before.
Maria, your colleague already argued for this decision, so I have a different question. So Ukraine has a snap elections in 3 weeks. So kind of the future decisions would be up to the new parliament. How you also foresee the situation?
No, first of all, of course, as I mentioned before, tomorrow will be a committee on foreign affairs. Anyway, we will have consultations with Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we are looking forward again to get any comments or a meeting with the president of Ukraine, because in this issue we have to have common position as we had before all these 5 years. And even if we go further, it has to be, the only one position from different institutions. So that is why, of course, also a lot of misunderstanding were in the mass media. We just stopped our participation in summer session. And as we understand the whole circumstances, if we will make worse decisions. So that is why, of course, now we will have consultations, as we all understand that Council of Europe, it's not only Parliamentary Assembly, it's a lot of different institutions where Ukraine has its own international obligations and so on. So that is why, as I mentioned, so we will have our position inside our country, and then of course we have to coordinate with our partners, with other countries who has signed this joint statement and joint position. As really, as Andrea said, we are not able to accept as it is, and really we have to be more tough, if I can say, with our partners from Germany and France. As how to say, it's especially before the snap elections. I really, if the decision will be, of course, to stay in Parliamentary Assembly, I wish the next delegation all the best and to be even better than we were. But telling the truth, I have doubts, as we see how many revenge forces, pro-Russian forces, will be in the parliament. So that is why I would like to thank our Ukrainian delegation, because not only our country, our society has mentioned, and our partners, that we were one of the best delegation in PASE for all these 4 years. And telling the truth, I wish next delegation really all the best, but not to forget about principles and values on which this organization was founded.
So you've mentioned, and it was discussed, that Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia and Ukraine adopted a joint statement against the unconditional restoration of the Russian delegation's rights without honoring any of the Assembly's numerous demands. We have chance to talk to Georgi Kandelaki, who is a Georgian member of parliament and a member of the delegation. So, Georgi, we read the joint statement of the 7 nations which voted against Russia being back with all the rights unconditionally to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Yet, what's next? Because, for instance, the Ukrainian delegation has decided to leave the Parliamentary Assembly. So, what Georgia is going to do in order not to leave the things as they are?
First of all, one has to stress that the painful sanctions, the economic and personal sanctions that the European Union imposed on Russia, of course, as well as the United States, these sanctions are obviously in place, and no one is going to review them. And as far as I know, the United States is is discussing new package of sanctions. The decision to lift the Council of Europe sanctions, which obviously are not as painful as the EU sanctions, it's a mistake. What's next? Well, I have to stress that the Ukrainian delegation, the current delegation, which obviously will change after the Ukrainian elections, did everything it could, and they fought honorably together with us and other friends and allies against this mistake, to reverse this mistake. And I think it would be very important for what happened this week in Strasbourg not to be used by anyone in the internal Ukrainian political discussion or election campaign. That would be very important. Obviously, now everybody looks to Ukraine. One also has to remember and what happens in Ukraine after the elections, and whether the new delegation continues the line of the old delegation. One also has to stress that in cases of Baltic states and Poland, well, as well as Georgia, but Baltic states and Poland are EU member states, their delegations stood there fully on behalf of their governments in their entirety. The Baltic foreign ministers, and some prime ministers, and the Estonian president also made very, very harsh statements. But any future action will be impossible without Ukraine. So we are all waiting for the result of the Ukrainian election and for the new, let's say so, policy to be clearly formulated.
So we have quite a big group here of the Ukrainians, both members of the delegation and the people dealing with the issue. But what the Ukrainians can expect on its allies and partners in the nearest future, and is it just the Ukrainian situation and just the case important for Ukraine? As from the particularly the statement, the Georgian delegation was a part of it. It was said that the future of the Council of Europe is under threat as a whole because of the Council of Europe is losing the trust of the people it stands to protect. So how would you describe what still the other countries may do, and how possible to vote with the other members who probably supported the decision at this stage?
Ukraine can expect and can count on solidarity from these countries, especially the Baltic states and Poland, and obviously Georgia. And Georgian delegation too stood there together, all of the delegation, despite our internal political differences. As you know, I represent opposition in Georgia, but we were able to convince our colleagues from the ruling majority to join us, and they did. Of course, then there is the UK delegation, which led the effort against this wrong policy, let's say so. So Ukraine can count on solidarity. We are just waiting for its new parliamentary delegation and the policy of the new government to be clearly formulated. So anyone who says it will be just Ukraine is mistaken. It will not be like that, because for us, for Georgia, obviously what happened is unacceptable, and we cannot accept it. In the future, I'm in favor, and many members, many colleagues from many countries are in favor of full boycott of the work of the Parliamentary Assembly. If we actually have a full boycott of several countries, 4, 5, 6, doesn't matter, the crisis of legitimacy there will be such that we will have a renewal of modus operandi.
So just let me clarify. So it depends on what would be also the decision of the next Ukrainian delegation. And if so, if we speak about the autumn, we are waiting, and then the boycott can take place if the countries agrees.
That's correct. That's correct. Obviously, without the Ukrainian delegation itself, no future action can be really feasible for the simple reason that, let's say so, active war is taking place in Ukraine right now. Obviously, in Georgia is also the victim of occupation, and Georgia and Ukraine should play, in any case, as one team on the international arena, in the diplomatic arena. But Ukraine has to take lead.
Thanks a lot, Georgi, for talking to us, and we'll follow the discussion and won't let it kind of get buried in the all other news, heavy news agenda. Thank you. And so what, to finalize the whole story, of course, the decision was unpleasant. It was not. It was heavily criticized. Still, there would be the session in autumn. As a human rights defender, dealing a lot with the Council of Europe and the Parliamentary Assembly, what would you also advise for the future delegation? And probably there would be also the question to you: what would you, Andreas, also advise as a Ukrainian-based foreign expert to also the other MPs and who would take their further decisions in autumn?
First of all, I think it's a bad idea to don't give accept Council of Europe comes and observe our election, because it's not a question now for just for this MP delegation or just for our situation with the Russian Federation. It's another mechanism inside the Council of Europe. Partly it's connect with Parliamentary Assembly, but it's even partly it's connect with other directorates inside the Council of Europe. So it's important that international observers from Council of Europe be be here during the parliament election. So I think it's a bad idea to not, go out from Council of Europe or something like this and don't give this possibility to come here for observation. And second, I think it's really important to remember that in Council of Europe, first of all, it's place where the norms and principles of human rights in such a new area, like for example, human rights in internet or human rights in some new area about, I don't know, about sexual harassment against children or something like this. So it's a place where we need to be inside that discussion and make these principles. It's a really important understanding. It's not 4 times in the year coming to the session of Parliamentary Assembly. It's mean whole the year MPs need to work inside this structure. Whole the year you make some reports, you make some speech about not only situation who connect with Ukrainian, but situation who connect with all principles of human rights and hold the world sometimes, because Council of Europe, it's only one such place where we have European Court of Human Rights. That means no any other region have such mechanisms. So it's important that Ukrainians started being not just reactive, but proactive members of Parliament of Ukraine who will be in next delegation need to be proactive whole the year and work and make this own political power, diplomacy power, make them inside the Council of Europe. So it's for me that's more productive strategy than now just acting like children who was abused. So it's really important.
So what would be your message especially to the...
Well, I think it's very difficult actually now for Ukraine to define its position after what happened, because I totally agree that Ukraine would lose a lot if it would leave all the institutions, and it is, of course, in some ways an important assembly, and the court, especially the human rights courts, is very, very important. So, but on the other hand, Ukraine has to do something, and it has to be something significant. And maybe at the end of the day, it will turn out that the only significant thing that Ukraine can do is actually leave the whole institution and thereby give a signal. But I think the larger scheme here that comes to my mind is that this whole conflict illustrates a point which I think concerns the whole Ukrainian foreign policy, namely that Ukraine cannot count on the kind of support from Western Europe that it wants to get. That goes also concerning membership in the European Union, even the mere membership perspective from the European Union. That concerns the membership action plan of NATO. And you saw in this conflict with the Baltic countries, Poland, Georgia, and the US actually taking a very clear position who are the real partners and actually allies of Ukraine. And unfortunately, countries like Germany, Italy, France, they will be always these sort of hesitant allies, I would say. And that's why I think that has to have also for the next parliament and maybe also for the next foreign minister, maybe some conclusions of where Ukrainian foreign policy should go, namely to these allies, to these countries, especially Poland, which has been alienated over the last 5 years quite a lot by the memory policies in Ukraine, and the US, the Baltic countries. These are the ones one should work with. I was a little bit disappointed in the whole conflict here by the positions of Moldova and Romania. I would have thought that these should have been countries that would be on the side of Ukraine. They should have joined this group. I was sort of pleasantly surprised that Slovakia seemed to be, although it wasn't quite clear whether they are fully part of it, but maybe that is something, for instance, to work on in the direction of Moldova and Romania, and to have this group of support, and then maybe make a pact with this group of support. Create a sort of intermarium coalition, maybe with the US being part of it. That would be a way to go, or a conclusion from this whole conflict.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for trying to explain also quite a complicated discussion that we also not because really, if you read now the Ukrainian media, there is quite a panic mode, and the people have to pursue, look forward. That's what I also encourage you and follow. More coverage of Hromadske, not of course of the whole discussion around the Council of Europe and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, but all other stories, in particular the human rights-oriented stories. They are on our webpage, en.hromadske.ua. We are there for you 24/7 on our Twitter and Facebook. Search Hromadske International. And with that, I tell you goodbye.